What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and this is another episode of Datasheet Deep-Dive. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the datasheet for the Warp Talons in the new 10th edition Chaos Space Marine Codex. Discourse about these guys has been taking the internet by storm because of their insane special abilities and solid melee damage output, so let's dive in and talk about exactly what makes this datasheet so strong. Now, looking at their top-line profile, Warp Talons look like any standard fast attack infantry. They are fast at a base movement of 12 with the fly keyword. However, their defensive stats leave something to be desired. They're only toughness 4, and while they do have a 3+ armor save and a 5+ invulnerable save, which is a fairly nice bonus, at only 2 wounds, they're basically just looking at a tactical marine defensive profile with some additional benefits. They're also a low objective control value of 1, but they have a good melee profile. The unit comes stock with its Warp Claws, a twin-linked Strength 5 AP2 1 damage weapon that each model attacks with 4 times. Now, to make our lives easy for this video, they have no other weapon options. This is essentially a Lightning Claw profile. That Strength 5 AP2 power weapon style with that twin linked makes them good at attacking a variety of targets, especially those below toughness 9. Anything that they wound on 3s, 4s, or 5s with added redundancy from that twin linked keyword gives them an extremely predictable damage output. Being a jump pack infantry unit, they also have the Deep Strike ability, as well as the faction ability Dark Pact, which can buff that Warp Claws attack. These guys will be able to Dark Pact for either lethal hits or sustained hits. Typically, they'll be looking for sustained hits because they do have that twin-linked keyword to make up their wound rolls, so they don't necessarily need the additional effect of lethal hits, but against toughness values of 10 or higher that they would be wounding on 6s, lethals are actually slightly better. Now, as powerful as Dark Pacts are to buff the melee output of this unit, they want to try to refrain from using them for as much as possible, since they have no redundancy on their Dark Pact check. So they actually have a pretty reasonable chance of failing at a leadership characteristic of 6 and no effects like Chaos Icons available to them to reroll failures. If they do fail any of those Dark Pact checks, there's a pretty reasonable chance at 2 wounds per model that you will lose 1 model to the mortal wounds from that failed Dark Pact, which can then make it tougher, especially if you're taking small units of these guys, to actually kill what they're charging. And, as we'll talk about momentarily, killing what they charge is extremely important. Now, last and certainly not least, the most important thing on this datasheet probably is their ability Warp Strike. At the end of the fight phase, if this unit was eligible to fight this phase and it's not within engagement range of 1 or more enemy units, you can remove it from the battlefield and place it into strategic reserve. While Warp Talons are in strategic reserve because they have the Deep Strike ability, they can then return to the table in your reinforcement step 9 inches away from enemies rather than following the normal strategic reserve rules. Now, that's a lot of words to explain what this ability does, so let's break it down really quickly. The unit is eligible to fight if at any point during that fight phase it was engaging an enemy unit. It doesn't actually have to have fought in order to trigger this ability. You're also eligible to fight if you made a charge move that turn, whether that means that you heroically intervened that turn or you charged in the previous charge phase. So if either of those things were true, you charged this turn or you were engaging an enemy unit, and you are not currently engaging an enemy unit at the end of that fight phase, you can then put the Warp Talons back into strategic reserve, and this works at the end of any player's fight phase. It doesn't specify a specific fight phase, so it checks for eligibility essentially at the end of every player's turn. Now, 99% of the time, the way you're going to see this ability used is that the Warp Talons are going to charge into something relatively light that they have a pretty good chance of killing. They're going to wipe it out because they're each attacking 4 times with pretty solid AP and strength twin-linked weapons. At the end of that phase, they're going to go back into reserve. Because the ability doesn't specify when they arrive, they can potentially immediately rapid ingress at the end of the subsequent movement phase. This allows them to persistently deal solid damage to your opponent's army essentially every turn of the game, and there is very little way you can stop it until they stop killing whatever it is they charge. They don't even have to come in back out of rapid ingress. They could just Deep Strike normally in the Chaos Space Marine player's movement phase and try to charge out of Deep Strike, or just set up to move and charge in a future turn. Now, with that being the case, the timing actually opens up some weird possibilities to use this ability in ways that you wouldn't necessarily expect, by charging enemy units and not killing them, but still remaining unengaged from them. Especially for small units of 5 Warp Talons, it is possible to engage only into enemy models that you're sure you can kill on your charge. If your target unit has wounded models, and the Warp Talons can charge in and engage only those wounded models, saves must be assigned to wounded models in a unit first, unless they are an attached character. So if the Warp Talons do any damage, which is probably pretty reliable, unreliable, those saves will have to be assigned to that damaged model, they'll be destroyed, and the Warp Talons will be unengaged. They could then be called upon to consolidate, but consolidation is optional, so they can choose not to go back into engagement range, which not only prevents the now unengaged enemy unit from fighting, but also allows the Warp Talons to warp strike away. Similarly, if they can charge into a weakened enemy unit that has a character attached, they can potentially kill the unit, but not engage the character. Since saves must be assigned to bodyguard models in an attached unit first, the character is not allowed to take saves until the rest of the unit is destroyed, meaning again, the Warp Talons could potentially charge into a unit, leave the character alive, but still warp strike at the end of the phase. If you can give the Warp Talons precision, and there is a way to do this that we'll talk about as we move on to Detachment Synergies, you could also do the opposite. Charge into the character in a unit, but not engage the remainder of the unit. Fight, put all of your saves on the character, probably kill them, and then warp strike away without touching the attached unit at all. The timing and requirements of this ability are very fine, but can be used in some absolutely bizarre ways in particular corner cases. Now, overall, this is not a unit that's going to be going into brawl with the heaviest targets. Only being strength 5 and AP 2 means that heavy armor, things like Land Raiders, are probably not going to take too much damage from them. Although, with lethal hits and a bunch of attacks, Warp Talons still will leave a dent in basically any target that they impact. That said, Warp Talons are purpose-built to kill light or medium targets. Small units of 10 Imperial Guardsmen, for example, are going to be absolutely dissected by a unit of Warp Talons, and even heavier units like other Space Marine units stand a pretty good chance of being taken down by 5 of them. Once you start taking them in larger numbers, since the unit composition goes up to 10 models, they can start to tackle even larger prey. Things like heavy infantry or large units of other medium toughness 4, 3+ save infantry start to go down fairly reliably to these big bricks of Warp Talons. And with that many attacks, once you start buffing those attacks with rerolls, enhanced critical effects, or other bonuses, that goes even farther. When using these guys, however, the choice of target is paramount, because the game plan is going to be to eviscerate whatever they impact and leave them open to warp strike again to then reposition, redeploy, and re-engage on the next turn. If you can do so with a long threat range, and many detachments in the Chaos Space Marine Codex grant things like advance and charge or enhanced movement, these guys essentially act as the world's most lethal indirect fire. They charge into an enemy unit from behind line of sight blocking terrain, while the rest of your army is not required to move out and engage that unit, destroy it, and remove themselves from the fight back into reserve in order to set up and do it again the next turn. That then forces enemy armies out into the open with their more powerful combat units to actually compete on scenario, because small units of Warp Talons can constantly be eviscerating their frontline screens, objective holders, or utility units, which then allows the Chaos Space Marine guns and more dedicated melee options to just kill them. These guys are able to bleed the opponent dry of units, essentially without the ability for your opponent to respond to them, and they synergize perfectly with the Space Marine game plan of trying to force your opponent into a pitched engagement in the center, where the Chaos Space Marine Dark Pacts and overlapping synergies will obliterate them. And that gets made even better when you consider their detachment synergies. Now, being a normal Heretic Astartes infantry unit, for the most part, Warp Talons have a lot of synergy with a lot of these detachments, so I'm probably not going to hit on every single stratagem or ability that can be used with them, although one thing that does make it easier is that they have no attachment options. No characters can go in here, and most enhancements don't benefit them either, so that does make things a little simpler. Now, one of the biggest missed opportunities in the Codex is synergy between Warp Talons and the Dread Talons detachment, which focuses on Raptors and jump back infantry. They're able to gain AP bonuses and enhanced deep strikes from Screaming Descent, but then can't charge, so it's of limited usefulness. However, the detachment really wants you to move aggressively forward, engage your opponent, and remain in range of them to force battle shock checks and debuff their leadership. However, Warp Talons, if things are going well, are basically always going to be in strategic reserve, so they don't really synergize well with the detachment ability. Deceptors have some buffs for them from all sides, can grant them some charge buffs, especially if you're engaging with other units. And since Warp Talons can co-charge with either other Warp Talon units or other Chaos Space Marine units, and then even if the unit that they charged alongside kills their charge target, as long as they were eligible to fight that phase, and charging makes you eligible, they're able to pull back off the table. So in the larger, more pitched engagements, like From All Sides is trying to set up, Warp Talons actually have a little bit of a spot. You're also infiltrating very heavily with that list, which tends to have a little bit of synergy with deep strikers because your opponent has less of an opportunity to screen you out. Although I think Warp Talons will spend most of their time on the table, at least at the beginning of the game before they start killing enemy units. So I don't know how impactful that will be. Veterans of the Long War gives you hit rerolls. That's a huge buff to Warp Talons since that's the one part of the attack sequence where they don't have baked in rerolls. They're already rerolling their wound rolls, but their hit rolls are where you can spike low, and getting a little bit of redundancy in that step makes them so much stronger. However, Pact-bound Zealots are where these guys start to go absolutely insane. Marking Warp Talons with either the Mark of Khorne or Slaanesh to improve their melee attacks makes them that much more reliable at killing whatever they charge. On top of that, Slaanesh Warp Talons in particular go absolutely nuts. Against most infantry profiles that are lower than toughness like 10, so that's basically every infantry in the game, you are almost always going to be choosing sustained hits for your Dark Pact rolls. The Mark of Slaanesh improved your criticals for the sustained hits Dark Pact to 5 up, essentially giving the Warp Talons an additional bonus of +1 to hit and making them even better at clearing out infantry. On top of that, the Slaanesh specific stratagem allows for advance and charge, which again can extend the threat range of Warp Talons to astronomical distances and allow you to clear out your opponent's units even if they're not actively projecting them into the center of the table to allow the Warp Talons to attack. Now, last and absolutely not least, let's talk about Renegade Raiders. In my opinion, this is probably the best detachment in the Codex and seems almost purpose-built for Warp Talons. First of all, when Renegade Raiders attack an enemy on an objective marker, they get +1 AP. That's a huge buff. AP2 to AP3 is a very big deal, especially when you're talking about kind of carapace armored infantry, things with a 4+ save, then don't get a save against their Warp Claws, and that makes them immensely more reliable. Again, they can also get advance and charge from the Reaver's Haste stratagem. That's good for all the reasons that we just talked about in Pact-bound Zealots. Scour and Siege also allows you to gain precision to pick out characters that you're engaging. So in that maneuver that I discussed earlier in the video, where they engage only the character in an attached unit, then use precision to kill him, and then end up unengaged at the end of that phase, that is how you would turn that on. It's very niche and very specific, but in some instances, there will be situations in which that can work. The last stratagem we're going to talk about in here is a game changer for this unit. Opportunistic Raiders allows you at the end of the fight phase to fall back if you are eligible to fight in that phase. It has the same trigger and timing as the Warp Talons ability itself. This is nuts. If you are attacking on your own turn, you can sequence these effects in whatever order you choose, meaning that you can choose to use Opportunistic Raiders first, fall the Warp Talons back out of engagement range of anything that attacked them, then use Warp Strike to go into reserve. You are eligible to attack that phase, you're not engagement range of any enemy units, so you're good to go. Well, it's not going to come up so often. The fact that those are the same timing means it probably doesn't work on your opponent's turn, since your opponent will tell you to resolve the Opportunistic Raiders later. This stratagem essentially makes it free for Warp Talons to attack into whatever they want. They can charge a big vehicle, attack it, then at the end of the phase, fall back and teleport away and recycle to do it later. Even if they roll dramatically low and don't kill whatever they're charging, for the low cost of 1 CP, you can move them out of engagement anyway and still teleport them into reserve, making them entirely uninteractable for your opponent. The opposing thing engaging you, if you are engaged at that point, does still get to attack you back. So if you charge into a knight, for example, don't kill it and then get swept up off the table, you couldn't use Opportunistic Raiders because you were dead. But it still means that into enemies that are heavily armored but aren't good at punching the Warp Talons, especially things like tanks, or when you're engaging multiple enemy units that you're not sure you can kill all of them, you still have that get out of jail free card that allows the Warp Talons to jump into reserve. Now, alongside that +1 AP, the Warp Talons are also dealing fairly reasonable damage in this detachment. We're going to talk a lot when we move on to talking about how to defeat Warp Talons, about manipulating the percentage chances of them wiping your unit out and allowing them to Warp Strike away. Now, assuming that we are benefiting from the Renegade Raiders detachment ability and we are coming in at AP3, and to be honest, you can also, for a lot of these instances, sort of sub in other effects that are within a couple percentage points of this similar results. For example, 5+ critical hits for sustained hits in the Pact-bound Zealots is only slightly worse than +1 AP against a vast majority of targets. So you can get kind of an idea of how much damage these guys are doing across a multitude of detachments. In Renegade Raiders, however, specifically, versus a light infantry unit that they are wounding on 3s, and for this example, I'm going to assume that everything everything they're attacking has a 3+ save. So these would be like Battle Sisters, for example. You can expect just about 2.5 damage per model, or just under 12.5 damage for an entire unit of 5. Because they're all 1 damage attacks, you're not going to have any lost efficiency going into odd wound counts. So you're expecting, with no other buffs other than the +1 AP and sustained hits, to kill probably 12 models in a large light infantry squad. If you're going into a lower save, that's going to be even better. So things like Tau Fire Warriors or Imperial Guardsmen, you can expect to kill 15 or so. If you are going into heavier infantry that you're then wounding on 5s, they drop down to just over 1.5 damage per model, or about 7.6 damage for a full unit of 5. This is into heavy infantry units like Gravis, for example, or Terminators, which will have lower toughness but an improved save, which will come out to a very similar result. This means that the larger units of 10 are required when you are engaging into those heavier infantry units. However, things go a little bit sideways once you start hitting toughness 10+. At that stage, once you're wounding on 6s, you start to Dark Pact for lethal hits, and each model then averages against toughness 10 or higher with a 3+ save about 1.18 damage, or about 5.5 damage for a full squad of 5. So those heavier vehicles are definitely the Achilles heel of Warp Talons, and that's what they have trouble charging into and killing and then warp striking for free. So at that point, they would have to start using opportunistic raiders to jump away and launch themselves into reserve. However, small squads of 5 are still incredibly useful for being highly maneuverable, very easy to trade away into things if you don't need them to trigger Warp Strike, and extremely effective. Once they start killing 60 or 70 point infantry squads multiple times over the course of the game and returning into reserve, they're gonna just print money for you. Their value is gonna skyrocket because your opponent has no way of interacting with them. And speaking of interacting, let's talk about how to counterplay these guys. Now, I mentioned before that as often as they can, Warp Talons are probably not gonna be that excited about using Dark Pact checks, because there is a chance that they lose models before they make their attacks, and losing 4 Warp Claw attacks in a unit of 5 models, or even a larger unit of 10, can shift the chances of them killing what they charge pretty significantly. This means that dealing damage to them before they charge in is paramount. Indirect fire might be back. These are just tactical marines, and a lot of AP2, for example, indirect fire platforms can plink away at them over the course of the game. If you have heavier indirect fire platforms in factions like Astra Militarum, they can actually potentially knock enough Warp Talons out that they become essentially combat ineffective, and they are significantly worse at killing the things that they charge. A similar thing happens with Overwatch. Engaging with the Warp Talons on the Chaos player's turn is going to be incredibly powerful, so strong Overwatch, things like Flamestorm cannons, are going to be absolutely crucial. Again, it doesn't necessarily matter that you kill the entire Warp Talon squad, but if you kill enough of them that they can't mathematically take down what they're charging, they start to either bleed the Chaos Space Marine player command points to pull them out of melee if they're in Renegade Raiders, or they just don't even bother and let you kill them. The stock of Land Raider Redeemers is somehow continuing to improve. On top of that, high toughness and save characteristics can potentially pin these guys in melee, and setting up positions where you can react to their charge, for example, using Heroic Intervention to get multiple enemy units into them so they can't kill everything they're engaging, is good to keep in mind. The other way to defeat them is simply not giving them good targets to charge. That prevents them from getting free damage on your army and you just losing assets for basically no cost on the Warp Talon side. Using vertical elements of terrain like ruin walls to prevent their charge moves, or make their charges incredibly hard, or make it difficult to get the entire Warp Talon squad into melee with you, is an also good way to stop them from engaging, or make their charges tough enough that they won't even try it in the first place. And units with Fight First are also incredibly strong. They're able to deal damage as the Warp Talons come into them, especially units with reactive effects like free heroic interventions, or the Sanguinor, for example, who comes out of reserve. Any of those units that are even average at melee will deal damage to Warp Talons. They are essentially only a tactical marine profile, and a standard unit equipped with power swords that is swinging before they are is going to kill a ton of them and probably prevent them from killing you first. In those situations, the Chaos player probably doesn't even commit the Warp Talon into that position, meaning that they're not getting that free value that the unit is representing. Now, against the Warp Talons and Renegade Raiders specifically, the fallback strat, Opportunistic Raiders, has very little counterplay, besides just killing the unit in the Chaos Space Marine player's own turn with Overwatch or Fight First, or sticking them in melee and punching them to death. It is important to remember that it can only be be used once each phase. It's also not a battle tactic, so it can't be duplicated by any strat duplication means. However, that also means you can't CP tax it, which is, I guess, a little unfortunate. Command point tax effects are still going to be useful in that situation, however, because Renegade Raiders has a lot of good battle tactic stratagems elsewhere in the detachment, and bleeding the Chaos Space Marine player of their command points means that they will have then less to fuel the Warp Talons, running out of melee and rapid ingressing and charging back in. That can pressure their command point economy to fuel the Warp Talons and make it easier for you to pin them down and actually kill them. And with that, that is all I have to say about this datasheet. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All your people are amazing and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.